Hi everybody,
Hello.
welcome back. We're in number 3 on the series about Jesus. So today's topic, we're going to just be looking through the Gospels again, in particular looking at the teachings and the warnings of Jesus. Okay, so yesterday, just to remind you, for day 1 we talked about the introductions to the Gospels and how they related that back to the great story that we've been looking at so far and how Jesus is the climax to it. Day 2 we looked at how Jesus was fulfilling that story in so many ways, and yet in a way that was probably misunderstood, a complete surprise to the people that he was teaching. So we looked at him being the new Israel, the true Sabbath, the true temple, and the true law. Okay, and today we're going to talk about his teachings. We've got to realise this was a real big turning point in the life of Israel. The climax of the story, their true king had come, but it wasn't like they were expecting. And Jesus is reshaping and redefining who this people are, who are then to take forward this kingdom project, this redemption project that God had started all the way back with Abraham. He was now reshaping them and saying who's in and who's out.
Cool.
Okay,
I'm a bit worried that the steam from my cup of tea is in front of you. Sorry.
They thought it was the Shekinah glory.
I'll just put it on my knee.
Okay. So we're going to talk about the parables. Parables are one of those things which seem really simple. Like they're the things that you teach your kids at Sunday school, aren't they? And we love them.
No, I was taught them. They said it was sort of a way of Jesus making things simple for kids.
Yeah, so an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. That's what I've heard. Actually, that's not true. And I want to just take that right up at the front. The parables, in general, are Jesus hiding the truth rather than exposing it. He's teaching it, but in a way that you have to really look to see.
Why would he hide the truth?
Well, I think this is part of it is because what he was saying was so revolutionary that it was going to get him killed much quicker than he wanted to be.
Okay, yeah.
So it was confronting some of the powers that were there and saying, do you realise who I am?
He's provoking them,
So
isn't
he
he?
is very provocative. And so he was doing it in a way that it took some understanding. It took some time to really look into, is that what he's saying? How is he saying it? What's he saying? And it's only for those who really had eyes to see. Do you remember that phrase he uses? Who has ears to hear, let him hear. It was like, okay, you're going to have to listen here, and you're really going to have to ask for God's help to interpret what you hear. So yeah, be careful how you listen, he says, and then tells the parable. So obviously some of those parables were about what does this kingdom now look like. Okay, so some of it is, I'm thinking of things like the unforgiving servant, parable of the unforgiving servant, where the clear message is about forgiveness and how because you're forgiven then you can forgive others. That's a clear message of how the people in the new kingdom are going to be able to live. Okay, and so we can kind of understand how to interpret that. But I want to talk about some of the others, and the majority of the parables that aren't just about behaviour but are about stories around kings returning to the land, or a master returning to his house and how he's received, all those kind of things. So let's have a look at one of them. This one's in Luke chapter 20. It's titled The Parable of the Tenants. Do you want to talk us through this story?
Do you want my tea?
I will. There's a massive cup of tea.
So this is one of those ones where I think the people listening would have been feeling a bit nervous, like he's talking about us here.
Or angry.
Why?
Oh, they got angry when they thought he was talking about them.
I see. Right, yeah. So, scared and angry. Shall I start again?
No, I think, well, it's both, isn't it? Some of them would be scared, some of them would be angry, yeah.
Okay. Anyway, so he was telling the story about a man who planted a vineyard and he rented it out to some farmers and went away for a long time. And then when harvest time was coming, he sent a servant to go and collect food. But the tenants beat up the servant and sent him packing.
Yeah.
So he sent another servant who they beat up, and so he sent a third, and they did the same again. They wounded him and threw him out. Then the owner of the vineyard said, "What shall I do? I'll send my son, whom I love.
Heard that before.
Perhaps they will respect him." But when the tenants saw him, they talked the matter over and they said, "This is the heir, so let's kill him and the inheritance will be ours." So they threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. And then Jesus talks to the people listening and says, "What then will the owner of the vineyard do to them? He will come and kill those tenants and give the vineyard to others."
Yeah.
It's kind of scary.
Yeah. And they say, I think it's in that version, they say, "May this never be." It's like, wow, this would be awful if this were to happen. They know what he's talking about. And this is the point with the parables, that he is almost always referring these stories directly to the people who are listening to him. And that's a really important thing to understand when we come to interpret those parables. So Jesus is saying, listen, this is the story. I'm returning. The king is coming back. The master is returning to the house. How do the servants, how do the subjects receive him? That's the message of so many of the parables. And yeah, we're then understanding, it's not about Jesus talking about his return in thousands of years. He's talking about his coming back as king to the people of Israel, and will they receive his rule? Okay, so really important that we understand this. There's a phrase that Jesus uses quite a bit called, he refers to himself as the Son of Man, and he says about the coming of the Son of Man. This is a phrase that's used back in Daniel chapter 7, which you should go and have a look at. It's, in the context, what it is about these four kingdoms again that come, and on the fourth kingdom there's lots of destruction amongst the people of God, and the fourth beast that is destroying everything. And then he talks about one like the Son of Man that comes on the clouds in glory, which you've heard Jesus say. But it's not about coming to the earth, it's about approaching God. And it says he approached the Ancient of Days, and he was given authority and power and glory, and all the nations of the earth worshipped him, and he was given a kingdom that would never end. And so this is what Jesus is referring to. It's the story back in Daniel talking about the kingdom of God becoming established on the earth and overthrowing all the other powers that there are. And so Jesus, when he's talking about this coming of the Son of Man, and we think about it in terms of, well, this is thousands of years away, actually he's talking about this is what's going to happen now. And so he uses this phrase, I tell you the truth, that this generation will not pass away until all these things are fulfilled. And lots of us have scratched our heads over that, thinking, what does he mean by this generation? When actually, he just meant this generation. It was going to happen in this generation. And sure enough, 40 years later, the temple is destroyed, Jerusalem is ransacked, thousands and thousands of Jewish men are crucified. It's destruction as Rome exerts its might again. And actually the Christians were the ones that had read what Jesus had said, and they had left Jerusalem. So the Christians escaped. And directly from if you read the signs of the end of the age in the book of Luke chapter 21, and you'll see Jesus says, when you see Jerusalem being surrounded by armies, you know that its desolation is near. In other words, get out. And they did.
Okay.
Christians left. and the Jews decided they were going to stay and fight and got destroyed. Jesus was actually warning the people of the coming destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. And so sometimes we read it thinking, he's talking about sometime in history later on, thousands of years later, because it must be, because he uses what we call apocalyptic language. This language that is like, he talks about the sun being darkened and the moon being turned to blood. That's actually pictorial language. It doesn't mean literally the sun's going to be darkened. It means, like we would talk about in English, we'd say it was an earth-shattering event. We don't mean that the earth was literally shattered, normally. We mean this was such a big event that it was like the earth shattered. It's the same kind of thing. It's called apocalyptic language. And so Jesus uses that a lot because for them, as you can imagine, it was the end of the age. Up until then, the temple had been central to everything. Life in Jerusalem was still, although they were living under the oppression of the Romans, they still were allowed to sacrifice, do all their stuff that they did as the Jewish religion, still having dreams of freedom, and suddenly everything was crushed. Temple destroyed, Jerusalem was destroyed, and with it so much of their dreams. Never to be rebuilt, actually, not for the Jews. So it was at the end of an age. It was the end of Judaism as they knew it, and of the beginning of a new age. That's what Jesus is talking about, the new age of the kingdom, which is what we're living in now.
It's interesting because I used to think, that parable about the people with the talents, and they buried the talents, and then the master came back and he said, "What have you done?"
Yes.
And I used to feel really guilty about it, and think, am I using my gifts enough, and am I being a steward enough for God? And I remember someone saying, if you don't play the piano more in church, then you'll lose it. That kind of thing.
Based on that parable.
Yeah. And then our friend Pete taught me that actually it was for those people in that time.
Yeah. Yeah,
I was released.
Yeah, good. And you can still play the piano, can't you? And use your gifts for God.
Yeah.
But you don't have that sense of judgment hanging over you.
Yeah, I know, because it was really a big deal for me, actually, for a lot of years.
Yeah.
Because I was thinking, I'm looking after the babies and...
Yeah. Yeah, and we can use these parables wrongly in our teaching, can't
exactly.
we? If we don't interpret them well. Whereas Jesus is talking, let me say it again, into that context for those people at that time. Now we can take some things from that. It's not like we just ignore it and say, it's for them, so we don't have anything to say about that. Obviously they've been included so that we can learn, but we don't actually apply it directly to ourselves in that same way.
Makes me want to go back and read it all.
Yeah, go for it. Okay, so let's just say that in all these warnings, we've got the teachings of Jesus, we've got the parables of the kingdom, and we've got these warnings of the coming judgment that are all in there together. And we find that as we approach Jerusalem, Jesus gets more and more clear about his role and why he's coming. And he also seems to get more emotional. Do you remember he rides into Jerusalem on the donkey, and they're all crying Hosanna. But at the end of that, it says, Luke records, he looked over Jerusalem and wept. He wept for Jerusalem and says, you didn't recognise the time of God's coming. See, all these parables of the king returning, of the master returning, was actually talking about Jesus and the people of Israel. Did they receive him or not? This is the defining moment in Israel's history. Would they receive their returning king or not? Some of them did, some of them didn't. But that was where Israel was now to be reshaped around their new king, King Jesus. Okay, we're going to just concentrate a little bit more on the parables in our discussion time this week. Have a look at Luke chapter 14, verses 15 to 24. There's a parable called the parable of the great banquet. So have a read through that. And the question is, what impact would this parable have in that context, there and then? Okay, we'll talk about that this week.
I've got homework too.
Oh yeah, what's that?
If anyone can spot what's gone wrong with the continuity between our videos in this session, I will buy you some chocolate. If we're in the same room together, I'm not going to send it to Zambia or something.
Okay.
But if
you
we're
have to
ever,
come and collect it.
if we're ever together and you tell me what went wrong, what you spotted, then I'll buy you a treat. You don't do treats for your homework.
No, not yet. Maybe someday. Okay, we'll talk again tomorrow.
Bye.
Bye now.